It is 6:31. Let's call the special committee meeting of the Land Use Citizen Task Force of the Lake Bluff Park District to order. It's February 8th, 2022. We have I think a very interesting agenda this evening. And let's start with the roll call, please. John?
Chairperson Kraus.
Here.
Task Force Member Snoblin.
Here.
Member Russell.
Here.
Member Dewart.
Here.
Member Gottschall.
Here.
Member Treffs. And Member Douglas. Not here. Okay.
So we have a quorum. Rob sent me an email earlier, said he had a conflict and he is looking forward to watching us on video. So if you want, you can make a secret hello to Rob when he's watching us. Next item is a new item for us. One of the things that we started last meeting is asking Nikki to take some notes and summarize facts or information that we want to preserve as part of this discussion and to help us prepare the report that we'll be writing in a few months. So agenda item 1C is a summarizing the discussions from our prior meeting. I'd like to get in the habit of just looking at it every meeting that we have, just to make sure everybody's comfortable with what we've written down. Nikki has prepared this, Julie's taken a look at it. But I just would like an opportunity for people just to take a look at what we're summarizing from the last meeting. Are there any questions on those points from January 25?
Yeah, this is George. I have a couple comments.
Sure.
Probably the most important, the very last sentence says the golf course property does not have wetlands in it. It most certainly does. So
I think, yeah.
Ponds and everything are.
Yeah, I think wetlands in the sense of being wetlands that would qualify for mitigation credits do not now exist. So, but it certainly is a wet area. It's a floodplain. There's a river that runs through it. So I was thinking of that as well. Maybe we can just modify that a little bit so that we're clear as to what we mean.
And then probably it is better to use the word detention rather than retention throughout the document.
Instead of retention area, detention area.
Detention.
Okay, good.
And then that grant from SMC was also not just design and restoration, but the construction as well. Not reconstruction of the whole course, but any construction associated with the creation of a wetland banks and redoing golf course holes that were impacted if we went that way. So construction should be in there also.
Okay, so design work, comma, construction and restoration. Great.
I'm really glad that George brought up the point about use of the word wetland, because I thought about that myself when I was reading the minutes and also looking at the maps. I think we should be very careful. I guess I would like us to use the term wetland not just as an area that floods. I think, well, okay, so what I'm saying is let's make a distinction between an area that floods and a wetland. So I would say that currently on the golf course, we do not have a wetland, but we have areas that flood. Would that be accurate?
No, because there's ponds and everything absolutely qualify as wetlands, and I'm sure there's wetlands in immediate proximity. If someone went out there and did a wetland delineation, there'd be many acres of wetlands on the golf course. So it's easy to.
How do we want to define wetland then? Because I think we're going to need to make a distinction between wetlands that exist and then wetlands that may or may not end up being created for banking purposes.
I would suggest for this document, I would just get rid of that first phrase and just leave it as the mitigation project does not necessarily need wetlands, because part of this whole effort of understanding that we have to go through and get educated on is, you know, what type of wetlands qualify as mitigation banks, the crop areas that are currently defined as wetlands. Are they able to count those? I don't know. Tom probably can answer, but for purposes of this document right here, the simplest way is to get rid of the phrase, the golf course property does not have wetlands. That'd be my suggestion.
Well, that may solve it for this document, but I think it's a good point that we ought to have a general baseline understanding of what the term wetlands is going to mean and how we use it.
Correct. And we'll have a
so-
much better feel for that after tonight.
I was just
Okay.
thinking the same thing. So for
Okay,
today,
so we'll
why don't
come
we
up
just, for today, why don't we just strike that first clause in the last sentence, recognizing that we're going to need to define wetlands,
Okay.
okay?
Okay.
And not to belabor the point, but I've suggested to Steve that we create a glossary of terms that we and the general public may not be familiar with. And I think we can also use that to provide explicit definitions of terms that we may be using. So wetland would probably end up being one of them.
That was actually next on my discussion, is that I think that's a great idea. And we're going to be coming across a lot of terms that I know I need to look up, especially in the H&H study, I needed to look up and understand. So Nikki is going to be identifying ones that come to mind, and we'll be putting a glossary together. If there are terms that you think need to be defined, let us know either during the meeting or afterwards through John. And we'll just get our terminology correct. I think it is really important to be specific on our terminology. A word like wetlands can mean different things. And since this is going to be a topic of some contention, I think using it appropriately and consistently is going to be critical. Okay.
I just added 2 more words, thanks to George: detention and retention.
Okay. Nikki, thanks for putting this together. My recommendation is that we just add to this document for every meeting, so we don't have a new we have an addition, you know, with the terms that we're discussing each time.
I would like to question the second sentence in the second paragraph.
Okay.
It says they wish to widen the culvert on Route 41 at the railroad tracks. I believe that the culvert to be widened is substantially north of the railroad tracks. Up at Bittersweet Avenue and at Erie Court, not at the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks culvert, which is on the Skokie River itself, was deemed, I believe, to be wide enough so that it didn't need any widening.
All right. How about if we say they wish to widen a culvert on Route 41 to eliminate flooding of the Canadian National Underpass?
Good.
They're trying to eliminate flooding in the areas,
Yeah.
Steve, not the,
Well,
we should just get rid of, Al's right, we should just get rid of that reference to Canadian National Tracks.
To
All right.
eliminate flooding in the Route 41 corridor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, anything else? Thank you. At this point, as with every Park District meeting, there is a portion of time set for members of the audience who would like to address the task force on any matter that is within our area of responsibility. Are there any individuals who would like to ask a question or raise your hand? Jeff, there are none? Okay, let's move on then to agenda item number 2A. The minutes of the January 25, 2022 special committee meeting were distributed with our packet on Friday. I would entertain a motion to approve.
The only correction I have, a very small one, is at the bottom where you identify the people that spoke. I believe it was Tanya Sharman, Sharman, not Tanya Shaw.
Where's that? What page?
That's right before your signature, right at the back. Right above the adjournment.
So that also comes up on the first page of the minutes. Also present were Kurt Wolford, et cetera. Her first name is misspelled and it says Shaw instead of Sharman.
I believe that's correct. Based on the notes that I took. Good
Okay.
catch.
Any other?
I have a few, I do have a few other things on the minutes.
Okay.
One of them under items for discussion, here I was questioning the use of the word wetland. So it's in the first paragraph there under map and property review. The second sentence, one of the facts to be determined is what is the area of the park district that is a wetland that floods. Perhaps we could just say one of the facts to be determined is what is the area of the park district that floods. Would that be accurate?
Well, I did say a wetland. I mean, I was using the term wetland, not being sensitized to the document.
Okay,
It doesn't matter to me. I don't know what other people think. I would leave it. I would leave it, just recognizing that we're going to need to be more specific in the future. But that is what I said.
In the next line, Executive Director Beeler's last name is misspelled.
Huh. We'll look at that.
And then,
Anything?
actually, that looks accurate.
Hmm?
What page are you on?
Oh, it occurs twice. So this
Yeah.
is the same paragraph where I was questioning a wetland that floods. In the very next line, your last name is spelled with 2 E's, and in the next line after that, it is spelled correctly.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I see it.
And then on the page after that, this would be page 6 of the document. It, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th paragraph says Chairperson Kraus asked about past flooding of the golf course. I believe I asked about that, and then he asked Superintendent Mock to answer the question.
Okay.
And that is everything I've got.
Anyone else have any changes? Need a motion to approve as amended?
So moved.
Second?
George Russell, second.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Would you call the roll, please, on the approval of the amended minutes for January 25, 2022?
Chairperson Kraus,
Yes.
Member Snowblin,
Yes.
Member Russell,
Yes,
Member Dewart,
Aye.
Member Gottschall,
Yes.
Member Treffs,
Yes,
Okay, let's move on to the largest part of our agenda, which is the engineering considerations around, now I'm nervous about using the word, wetland credits. George, I will, since you've set this up, and can you give us a little bit of background and introduce our guest?
yes. Fellow members, we've got with us this evening, Tom Slowinski. Tom is with the engineering firm V3. It's a Midwest-based firm primarily. They have approximately 300 employees, and they have considerable expertise in wetland and water resource design and planning, as well as several other areas. And will be covered in Tom's introductory slides. So with that, I will turn it over to Tom.
Thank you. Let me share my screen, hopefully get this right. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for the opportunity to hopefully educate you about wetlands. I've been with V3 since 1989. Before that, I was in charge of the Corps of Engineers regulatory branch in the Chicago district for 6 years. So I'm going to talk about wetland and stream mitigation banking. Stream banking is somewhat new, but could have some applicability because you have the Skokie River as part of the potential mitigation bank. My background is in biology by education and ecology through experience. I'm a professional wetland scientist and I'm a certified wetland specialist in Lake County. And I'm V3's Wetlands and Ecology Technical Director. I'm in charge of V3's Wetland Mitigation Program. And I'll get into a little bit more details on that, but we have 2 wetland mitigation banks in Kane County. So a little bit on V3, go back to 1983, we're about 300 people. Some of our expertise related to your project is we do a lot of engineering surveying, that's our history. Wetland and water resources design and permitting. We actually have an ecological restoration construction group. And we've designed, permitted, and are constructed 6 wetland mitigation banks in Illinois and Indiana, and I've been involved in all of those. Just a little bit about our level of expertise. This kind of demonstrates our interdisciplinary workforce. We all work together on all kinds of different projects. We're mainly Midwest. We have some unique offices in Canada and Haiti, but those are long stories. But we have a lot of Midwest experience. A little bit on our Lake Bluff experience. We did some work in Tangley Oaks starting in 2012, some stormwater design and permitting. We did the Ravine Park erosion control. That was our construction group in 2013. That's how I met George. And we did another Moffett Road Land Bridge project in 2017. We are working for the Highland Park Country Club, which is being restored to a ecological nature park. That's our ecological restoration group. We've studied the Millard Bluff slope, erosion slope along Lake Michigan for the Park District of Highland Park. And recently we are involved in the Skokie River stream bank stabilization in Lake Forest, where we designed, permitted, and are constructing 1 mile of fixing severely eroded slopes of the Skokie River. Feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. V3 Wetland Restoration is our wetland mitigation entity. We're in a partnership with Campton Township since 2003. They had some property that was part of their open space preservation. We were selected to look at a mitigation bank on their property, which led to 2 very successful wetland mitigation banks. I'll have more details on those later. Part of our ecological success is our design, build, manage approach to wetland mitigation and restoration. That's where we do everything and control everything, including the financial aspects.
And Tom, this is Steve Krause. That I think is the part we are very interested in.
Correct.
From the beginning, how a credit is determined.
Yep.
You know, is it like a hockey game where it's a score, or is it more like, you know, figure skating, which is, you know, more of an art than a science.
Yeah,
And some-
this is very scientific and very quantitative.
So the more you can help us with that, the happier I'll be at least.
So, well, I'll get into our two mitigation banks in more detail, but that was, and mitigation banking is kind of a hobby for us because we're good at restoring wetlands. We've been involved since 2003. Our two banks totaled a $6 million investment on our behalf. And we've been in the red for a long time, but we've sold 21 credits, which are acres, last year. And there's a high demand for wetland mitigation credits in the Chicago area. But now the
Is that-
basics.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting again. I hope that's all right.
That's fine.
High demand. So one of the things that we need to be comfortable with is the economic model around the valuation of a credit and how variable that is based on economic risk, based on, other economic factors. So the more you can help us with that too, the better.
So a mitigating, and these are kind of the basic definitions. And your discussion on wetlands on the golf course, to be a wetland, you need wetland vegetation, hydrology, and hydric soils. So some ponds or wet areas or creeks may not qualify as wetlands, but they might be under Corps of Engineers jurisdiction as waters of the United States, of which wetlands is a subset.
Tom, can you repeat that, the factors that,
Oh, sure. Wetland vegetation, wetland hydrology, and hydric soils or wetland soils, and those are all very specifically defined terms under the federal wetland delineation methodology. And if you have a golf course that floods and it doesn't have wetland plants, it probably does not qualify as regulated wetland.
so you're using wetland in the ecological definition?
Well, there's a regulatory definition of
Okay,
what a wetland is that's regulated by the Corps and
Uh-huh.
Lake County SMC. And I can show you some examples as we get into this. But so a wetland mitigation bank and an acre is, one credit is 1 acre of wetland that's restored. So some of the terminology is wetlands are restored, reestablished, enhanced, or preserved for the purpose of providing compensatory mitigation for unavoidable impacts to wetlands authorized by either the Corps or Lake County SMC. And Mitigation Bank creates these acres of wetlands or credits that's all approved by the Corps of Engineers. I'll get into that a little bit more. But a mitigation banker sells credits to people who need permits that require wetland mitigation. Historically, before mitigation banks, there was a lot of on-site mitigation, which was small and had a lot of failure. So wetland mitigation banks were a mechanism to restore wetlands in large beneficial complexes, typically owned by a public agency and managed by a public agency. So these little bitty postage stamps, wetland mitigation projects, many of which failed over the years. It was a better process for people to mitigate for wetland impacts. So a mitigation bank instrument, I'm going to go to the next slide first. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process. So these are the mitigation banking rules. There's a federal rule and there's a Chicago District Corps of Engineers local rule that gets into definitions, the process, credit establishment, and performance standards. So here's the definition. Wetland reestablishment is basically restoring a wetland to drained hydric soils that may have been wetland historically. That's the preferred method of creating or restoring a wetland. You can do it through grading and hydrology, reestablishment, and planting plants. But the easiest way to do it is to recreate wetlands that were historically wetland. You can also get credit for restoring, enhancing, or rehabilitating an existing wetland. So if some of the golf course property had wetlands on it that could be improved and blended in with the new wetlands, you can get 50% credit for those. Wetland preservation, it's not very common, but you can get some minimal credit for that. And then buffers, mitigation banks typically require a 100-foot buffer around new wetlands, and you can get credit for that also.
So
When I show
Tom,
you our mitigation bank examples, I'll get into some of the credit details a little bit more.
okay, Tom, this is Steve again. So now I'm confused because on your what is a wetland mitigation bank slide? You said 1 acre equals 1 credit.
Correct.
But here on your definitions and credits, it isn't necessarily 1 acre equals 1 credit.
Well,
It
That's-
depends on the type
so-
of,
that's, yeah, good point. So let me explain that a little bit more later when I have some
Okay.
specific examples.
okay,
This is the mitigation banking approval process. This is all defined by the federal and the local rules. You have a prospectus, and this is probably kind of where SMC is, the concept plan. It might need a little bit of detail, but this is where you start the review by the Corps of Engineers, other agencies that form the interagency review team that in Illinois is the Corps, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the U.S. EPA. Sometimes the Illinois DNR gets involved, but not too much on mitigation banks. So the Corps reviews that. There's public input through a public notice process. And some people think the Corps needs to approve the prospectus, but to move forward. But sometimes you might wait a long time for that to happen, and that's not really a requirement. Then you go into a draft mitigation banking instrument that gets into all the details of how you're going to create wetlands, establish wetland credits, release wetland credits, and manage the mitigation bank. And if we have time, I can show you an example of our mitigation banking instrument for one of our banks. And then the final MBI is where all the details are tied up. The mitigation bank sponsor signs it, the property owner signs it if that's a different entity, and all the agencies sign it, and it becomes a legal document on how to manage your wetland mitigation bank. And depending on the complexity of the project and the agency responsiveness, that can take 1 to 3 years. The design itself can take a year to collect data, soils, hydrology, do the computer modeling, et cetera. Design your grading and your native planting plan. And that all is, and there's different levels to do that between the prospectus and the final MBI.
Okay, Tom, can I just interrupt? I want to make sure I've got it again. So the agencies that are involved in this here in Lake County would be the Army Corps, the EPA, and I thought you said a local agency. Which one was that?
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay, so not local.
And then from
do they
a
all-
Lake County SMC perspective, as long as the Corps of Engineers approves the bank,
Mhm.
you can use it for SMC permits. So the Corps is kind of the final agency of mitigation bank approval. So I think in one of the things I reviewed that SMC prepared, they had a little different number about once you get the bank approval, you can sell 30% of the credits. That has been reduced to 20% in 2017. And then credits are released as the bank develops and you meet certain performance standards.
Excuse me, Tom. Where in this process do you actually know what your wetland credits are?
That's part of the design process. And let me go into that when I show you our two examples. I can get into some of those details and it might be a little easier to understand.
Okay.
So one of the risks, and I'll get into the risks in a little bit more detail. The bottom line, to sell credits after your initial release, you have to meet certain performance standards, both from the wetland hydrology, or you need to have certain amount. The wetlands have to be wet enough to qualify as wetlands. And then you have to meet certain vegetative performance standards. Basically, how diverse is your native plant community, and can't have much invasive species at all to get your credit releases. And the final credit release can't occur until after the 5th year of management and monitoring, and you have to meet all final performance standards then and have a final agency approved wetland delineation.
So let me just pause for a second. So I think this is an important point for us to document. And without putting words in your mouth, is it correct to say that the maximization of whatever dollars could result from the sale of wetland mitigation credits would typically not be fully realized until 8 or more years after the decision is made to work towards mitigation credits?
Well, it could last that long, but once your mitigation bank is approved, it's at least 5 years.
Okay.
And I haven't looked at the SMC design, and I don't know how many credits they're talking about.
There has been
Again,
there has been an estimate of credits. That's one of the things we want to talk to you about. There has not been, to my knowledge, a rigorous determination of the potential credits on the Park District property.
Okay, I think George told me they're having Hay and Associates work on the design, and they're competent wetland mitigation bank designers, and we've worked with them and competed with them. They do know what they're doing. So for what that's worth.
That's
So Steve?
yeah.
So I think that the amount of time, what I think I hear is once we get to the first issue of funding, from that point until the year 5 is the disbursement. And then, Tom, the amount of time up to the first disbursement would be a couple of years. Is that correct? 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, it would be after the design is complete and the Corps of Engineers and other agencies approve the mitigation banking instrument.
Okay, and to go, and I'm looking on my computer here to jump back here. So when you get your final MBI approval, then they will release 20% of credit.
Correct.
But to get to MBI approval will take a couple of 3 years.
It could, yes.
Okay, so I just want, I thought that I was adding them up, and I heard Steve kind of totaled up to the 8. I just wanted to make sure that I understood the composition of that. So we're here in somewhere between year 0 and year 1, depending on where Hay and SMC might be with whatever documents they've already assembled.
All right.
Yeah, and Mark, I think that's right. And I think what's important for our consideration is that if a decision is made to move into the wetland mitigation business, that an anticipated income stream would need to be factored into the economic model.
Yep.
That to determine what the actual effective, rate of return on any investment. So it's not an immediate payback. It is a payback that potentially could take up to a decade.
Well,
Depending on how long it takes to move through the regulatory process, I would suppose.
And depending on how fast credits sell, because the 5-year is on credits released. It's not automatically sold. So
Well,
the important part here, not to bicker about 7 or 8 or 6 or 5, it's that it's a multi-year process to get the full economic value
Yeah.
of credit.
Yeah, and I think it's substantive to understand that as we might wonder how funds might end up being used, that it's not like somebody's going to write a check in 2 or 3 years and we're going to walk away with potentially a significant amount of funds.
Yep.
And to refine the point one step further, if I'm understanding, we first have to create the wetlands and we have to create them to meet the different standards that you set forth. Any sense of how long that takes, starting from a golf course or what we've got out there to creating viable wetlands that would be approved?
I'll get into that with, I'm going to show you this, our Gray Willows Wetland Mitigation Bank.
Okay.
That would be kind of a case study, Tom?
Yes.
Okay, that would be helpful.
So this is our second mitigation bank. It's probably more similar to the golf course than our other one, because the other one was just a farm field. So this project started in 2015. We did the design, a little bit on the property. This is a farm field in the center of the property. This is creek, Fearson Creek, a pretty high quality stream with meanders. And this blue area here was a turf grass field.
Can you use your cursor on that there, Tom?
Oh, can you
there
see
you go.
that?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Gotcha. I found it.
So
Thank you.
This was a farm field in the middle.
Uh-huh.
This was a nice creek with some turf grass. And this property has some interesting history that I'll tell you someday. But this is 208 acres. The owner did not want to sell it to a developer, so they sold it to Campton Township as part of their open space. And basically V3 is designing, building, monitoring, and we paid for everything up front. So it was a pretty big investment on our part. This whole project has a $3 million cost estimate. So we started the design in 2015. We did a delineation. We did some soils analysis and came up with this plan. There's 3 separate areas, which is a little unusual for a mitigation bank. But this was approved in 2017. We did the construction, was a little bit of grading, not a whole lot. There was a little existing pond here that was kind of a old farm pond that we turned into a nice wetland and got a little credit for it. This isn't the best scale, but this green hatching is 100-foot buffer around the whole wetland. Some of it was nice oak woods that we enhanced and got credit for. This white area up in the north was an existing wetland full of reed canary grass that we turned into a nice sedge meadow wet prairie wetland and got 50% credit. This area here was another smaller farm field. So we got the MBI approved in 2017. We had 20% of our credits released. And we actually had a pretty big sale of 10 acres for a transportation project that helped fund the construction. We started the native planting in 2018. We met hydrology standards, I think in 2019. So we got another, I don't remember how many credits released, but we didn't break even till this year. The fact that SMC is paying for the design and the construction, I think is a big benefit for your project. But it's a long-term investment when you're paying for everything, but the credits in the Chicago River can probably sell for $150,000 per acre. The SMC Wetland Restoration Fund for the Chicago River watershed is basically at just under 150,000 per acre. So they've kind of set the market price for credits. The one nice thing about a core approved bank, you can sell credits anywhere in the Chicago district boundaries for any Corps of Engineers permit. We've sold credits in this Kane County bank for MWRD permits that needs mitigation. So there is a big service area or market area for your potential mitigation bank that I think is a real benefit.
So Tom, to jump in there real quick, as you were kind of highlighting, so you actually were able to obtain compensation, if that's the right word, of the first 20% before you started construction.
Correct. And the reason the agencies do that is to help pay for the construction.
Uh-huh, okay.
But the one thing, well, the one thing you have to be careful of, you can't scrimp on construction costs, especially when you're doing native plant installation. We use both plant plugs and wetland seed in our construction because the wetlands develop the quickest when you're using high quality plant material. And we planted probably 100,000 plant plugs that cost like $4 a piece. But that's how you meet performance standards in the second year. We're in our 5th year. Well, no, we just completed our 4th year of monitoring, and we have met all of the vegetative performance standards in the wetlands. Now the Corps won't release credits early, but we're well on our way to being able to sell our final 35% of our credit year. This is our other mitigation bank.
Could I interrupt you with a question, please?
Certainly.
Are the sales of credits a one-time thing? In other words, once you've sold all your credits, you're done and it's not an ongoing revenue stream? Or do credits get resold if there's no longer a need for them for the original purpose?
No, once they're sold, they're sold. You can't resell them. There's no secondary market for credits.
Okay, so this is not an ongoing revenue stream. It's a one-time.
Well, it's probably a 5 or 6 year revenue stream because, like, I'm going to talk about, this is our, well, let me go into this a little bit. So this is our first mitigation bank. We started working on it in 2003. We had 2 phases. This was phase 1. This was like 50 acres of credits. This was phase 2, and we had some remnant drain tile issues. And this was a farm field that had drain tiles everywhere, which are kind of shown in these red lines that are kind of hard to see. So what we did, we disabled all the drain tiles and got really wet quickly. Phase 1 worked really well. We sold those out fairly quickly. But phase 2, we had this was an adjacent property. We had to bypass a drain tile through this area, and it kind of still drained our wetlands. So we had some issues meeting performance standards. And that led to expanding phase 2 because Campton Township bought this property. So this part here has been going on since, I think, 2007. And we still haven't sold all the credits. So that's kind of where the risks get into mitigation bank. If it's not successful. But at Gray Willows, you know, we learned a lot through our first bank, and this one's working extremely well. And because we have one of our restoration ecologists managing it, and we have a site steward, basically one of our field ecologists that manages all our field crews. And one of the things we did in this central area, which is this, we couldn't predict what this hydrology would be. And this is what it was like before. It was a cornfield with this little farmed wetland here. So and this is like a big depression. So once we disabled the drain tiles, this got very wet. And our original planting plan didn't quite fit the actual hydrology. So we basically did an as-built planting plan with 6 or 7 different plant communities in here to match the hydrology. Now, if we didn't control everything and we had to deal with a contractor and change orders, it could have been a big mess. But that's kind of our approach to doing mitigation banking, the design, build, manage approach. Let me go, well, here, this is the kind of wetlands typically done in mitigation banks. This is a sedge meadow wet prairie, little on the drier side, as opposed to this emergent wetland with a prairie buffer. Let me get into, I got a slide here on risks. And these are somewhat general. The technical side, you need to have a good design. You need to understand what the hydrology will be as best you can and design a native plant community accordingly. And kind of the range of wetness, you go from a pond that has aquatic submergent vegetation to an emergent marsh, to a sedge meadow, to a wet prairie. That's kind of the range of wetland plant communities that are not forested. You need a really good restoration contractor. You need to invest heavily in native seed and plant plugs.
Can I interrupt for a second
Yeah.
here?
Yeah.
I just looked up hydrology. This is one of these terms that we need to understand what it is. So for our definition, it's the study of the distribution and movement of water, both on and below the Earth's surface. So it's water movement on a particular parcel. So Nikki, that's one of our defined terms.
This is a good slide right here.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so, and the wetland hydrology performance standards are somewhat, I guess, strange because they're not always tied to the plant community you're developing. So an emergent plant community, which is the wettest, the hydrology performance standard, it needs to have standing water for a certain length of the growing season. Our wetland plant communities are a little on the drier side, the sedge meadow wet prairie, so they need saturated soil or a groundwater within 12 inches of the surface, and the standard is 28 consecutive days. That doesn't happen every year. When we first installed our monitoring wells at Gray Willows, we had a very nice wet spring, and we met the standard right away. So that's kind of where you have to negotiate with the regulators when you're proposing performance standards to make sure that you can meet them. The plant communities, it's based on plant diversity or floristic quality. And you cannot have almost any invasive species present on your site. And the standards can get very technical and I don't even understand them myself. And then your final wetland delineation, where you determines your final wetland acreage, your final number of credits. You need to meet all 3 wetland criteria, which is vegetation, soils, and hydrology. And then back to the risks. We've been aware of some banks where there's a designer, there's a contractor, and there's a monitoring consultant, and they're all different. And that usually results in some level of finger pointing, blaming someone for a lack of success. We avoid that through our design, build, manage approach, where we basically pay for and control for everything, and we're reimbursed by credit sales. And then the financial risks, upfront costs can be extensive, and you don't get reimbursed for a couple of years. Actually, on Gray Willows, even with the construction, the native plant installation, and the invasive weed control in the first 2 years, we're still in the hole on that project. And we distribute some of the credit sales to Campton Township up front. So I think they get 15% of a credit sale, then we reimburse ourselves before we split any revenue. And you have to be able to deal with technical issues and field changes throughout the process. Because if you don't, you're not going to meet standards in the 5th year. And then, of course, you need to release and sell credits. For a number of years, we maybe sold 1 or 2 credits, and last year we sold 20. So the demand, after the recession and COVID, et cetera, the development community is coming back. And with the state of Illinois infrastructure funding, there's going to be a high credit demand for infrastructure projects. I mentioned we sold 10 credits to the Union Pacific Railroad for a extension of a rail line through DuPage and Kane County. And then you're relying on the agency to review your annual monitoring report when you're requesting credit release and respond in a reasonable time, which we have a fair amount of credibility with the regulators, and they've been out to our banks. They like the results, so they're kind of responsive in releasing credits.
Tom, the project that you said you're still in the hole on, when was that project started?
That's the that's the Gray Willows, this one.
Mm-hmm.
But we understood that going into it, and I think it's an accounting exercise, but it's been successful so far, and we're basically out of credits here at the moment, which is a good thing. We've sold all our credits that have been.
Okay, so help me understand. If you've sold all the credits, did I hear you say that you're still in the hole though? What is?
Oh yeah, because the upfront cost, the construction, the native plant installation, and I should have looked up those numbers, but
you have
those are
more,
big investments.
you have more credit yet to be approved.
Oh yeah, we have got 30% of our credits still to be sold. And hopefully the market will still be strong when those are released, hopefully in 2024, I believe.
Okay, and that project started when?
Well, it was approved and we started designing it and permitting it in 2015. And it was approved by the Corps in 2017. So we could sell credits and paid for a good portion of the construction and the native plant installation. And that was like a $2 million cost, and probably 3/4 of it has been reimbursed, with Campton Township receiving 15% of the credit revenue. But we're able to deal with that.
Mhm.
So I'm available for questions. I know it's kind of confusing, but it can be complicated.
Yeah, I have a bunch, but I'm gonna defer to my fellow task force members if they have questions.
And Tom, this is George Russell. Could you talk a little bit more about this $150,000 figure?
Yes.
How is that controlled? And then if there are a half a dozen different entities that have established wetland mitigation banks, what's the process as to where someone that needs to pay to mitigate their project, how do they select? Is it?
Well, it's kind of,
War?
well, there's some competition in the field. We don't really know what our competition is selling credits for, other than if another consultant comes to us and says, I need 2 credits and so is selling them for this. What are you selling them for? Our credits at the end of last year were selling for 120,000 per acre. When we started our first bank in 2003, we were at 45,000 per acre. So the fact that we were delayed in getting credits released has been a benefit. The Corps has a mitigation banking tracking system that's called Ribbits. And assuming it's up to date, it lists all of the mitigation banks in the Chicago District Corps and tells you how many credits they have. It doesn't say how much they cost, but the consulting community who needs to get credits for their clients knows who has credits available, generally what the costs are. So it's a big kind of word of mouth process.
And what is that? What is that an acronym for? Or just give me the acronym, we can look it up.
I'll pull it up.
Okay.
So
There it is.
it's Ribbits. I couldn't tell you what it stands for.
NIBITS, okay.
It's RIBITS. Here it is.
Ribbits.
The Regulatory In Lieu Fee and Bank Information Tracking System.
Oh, that's certainly self-explanatory.
It sounds very government.
Okay.
So this is,
So Tom, these dollar per acre is market driven to
Yes.
some extent, apparently. Does it matter what the quality, the underlying quality, is that a factor?
well, it's a factor if you're trying to get credits released.
Okay,
So let me go back to, and I have much more detailed presentations on both of our mitigation banks that, so the plant community is measured by called the Floristic Quality Index. So these are wetlands we created that are very diverse, high quality. Either this is a sedge meadow, it's a little wetter, and this is a wet prairie. The performance, and we've met the performance standards for these wetlands, which is how the credits were released. So once the credits are released, whether it's an emergent wetland or a sedge meadow or wet prairie, it doesn't matter to the Corps, as long as it's an approved credit that's been released.
okay, so you meet basic standards and you qualify.
Correct.
Okay,
And the first step is the wetland hydrology. Then there's an interim vegetative standard. And then it's your final performance standards to get credits released.
so could you end up paying, receiving less at the first release because you don't have final performance standards met?
No, the quality is independent of the price of the credit. The
Okay,
price is purely market driven.
gotcha. Okay,
And the bad side is if you've sold certain credits and you don't meet your performance standards at the end, you're gonna have to replace those credits somehow. Either you
okay,
go into year 6 or 7 or 8 and improve well, you can't really improve the hydrology.
uh-huh.
You can improve the plant community through supplemental seeding
Mhm.
or weed control management, invasive species management, et cetera.
So there's a certain amount of betting on the come on this. The expectation is that you deliver in the end, and if you don't, you have a balance due.
Correct.
Right.
And that's kind of why we got into this business, because we're very good at restoring wetlands or creating wetlands through our years of experience with just wetland mitigation projects. And our restoration ecologist, he's a whiz at developing a plant community for certain hydrology conditions, knowing what performance standards are reasonable and how to meet the more difficult ones.
So for a place like Lake Bluff, where does that expertise come from?
Well,
Yeah.
you can hire V3 to help you.
Okay.
Hay and Associates, the SMC designer has design experience.
Sure.
You know, I could see it kind of being whoever, whether it's V3 or not, we could help you review their design and say, well, yeah, this looks good or doesn't look good. And I know there's hydrology modeling involved in doing wetland restoration along a waterway where it's very flashy. I didn't really talk about stream credits, but the fact that
Let's stay on Julie's question for a minute, because I think it's
Okay.
important. So I think the essence of the question is that there are, in order to maximize the value of wetland credits that may be developed in the subject property, there needs to be an expenditure primarily for professional consulting services, which would be your firm or like you.
Yeah, Hayes does it.
Yeah, so there'd be an RFP process, and it would have to be, determination of the appropriate resource. Would there also be other professional services? I assume there's legal costs, banking costs. What other, to ask it in a very short way, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if a landowner it has a piece of property that they're looking to maximize their earnings through sale of wetland credits, is there a rule of thumb in terms of the percentage of the sale of those credits that actually derives to the property owner and the percentage that goes to the variety of consultants, bankers, attorneys that work on the project? Is there any rule of thumb for that?
I think our design cost was in the $200,000 range for gray willows. It might have been a little higher than that. Our total budget was, I think, just under $3 million through the design, the permitting, and the 5 years of management and monitoring. And we're still within budget in year 4. One of the issues with when we're competing with someone, and we did this recently with Lake County Forest Preserve, they hired someone else to help them design a mitigation bank. But you have to make sure you have enough money for invasive species control, because once it gets out of hand, it takes a big time and effort to get it back to a high quality plant community.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Is there a rule of thumb then for how much a property owner would expect to get versus the service providers? Just,
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, if you're not paying for the design or the construction,
Mhm.
that's a really good deal for a mitigation bank.
Is it your understanding that that would come through the grants that SMC is supposed to get? Does anybody know that?
Right.
That's the gist of the discussion we had last week. I think that's my understanding, and but obviously we need to confirm that and confirm whether that would cover more than the requested 40 acre feet, et cetera. So
Yeah, it's my understanding, and I was gonna whiz back here through what was shared with us, is that we would be that the surveying, titles, engineering, wetlands, prospectus, bonding, legal fees, and construction would all be managed by the grant, leaving us to deal with maintenance and the banking piece. So I guess at the end of the day, the question would be, what kind of fees would be involved in the banking side of it, Tom?
Well, it's pretty much, if SMC is doing the design and getting the permitting with you guys as an involved party on the making sure it meets your needs, you would be involved in the, I'm assuming, the sales of credits. And our budget for credit sales, of which I'm primarily involved, we had $100,000 set aside, and in 3 years, we haven't used that. The management and monitoring, I'm not current on our costs. It's mainly weed control, prescribed burning, monitoring, both quantitative and qualitative vegetative sampling, hydrology monitoring wells, and weed control. It's probably in the $50,000 per year range, depending on the final size. But I don't think I answered George's question on where did the $150,000 come from. SMC has a wetland restoration fund. It's an in lieu fee fund where you pay money to a fund instead of buying credits where credits aren't available. They have set the price for the Chicago River watershed as $149,000. And they have other prices for the Des Plaines River watershed, and I think the Fox, they're somewhat less than that. That's kind of the market price for, and maybe that's a little high if the competition is like our bank is 120,000 per credit. But, and I don't know how many credits SMC is talking about, but our Gray Willows is 52 credits. Our cost per credit was a little higher than we would like. I think it was like $50,000 an acre total. But it was a complicated site, and the credit sale price can justify that.
So I'm sorry, the $50,000 cost per credit was your
I think that was our cost
design
per
development?
credit for the whole ball of wax.
Okay, Great.
Okay.
Tom, does it at some point once the MBI is approved and all the credits are sold, does the Corps ever become detached from the Wetland Mitigation Bank? Or
Yeah,
do they have inspections? And what I'm really wondering about is what kind of cost the Park District would be saddled with for maintenance, invasive species control. I thought I heard you say $50,000 a year. Does that just go on forever?
Well, as part of the MBI, you prepare a long-term management plan, but it's kind of general. But once a bank is established, and like this is our headwaters, we have very little invasive species. When we completed the sale of all the credits on phase 1, we turned the property over to the Campton Township, and it was their responsibility to kind of keep it at a similar quality. The Corps is not involved once they certify all the credits after the 5 years of management and monitoring, and they're not involved anymore. And then it's kind of, and actually, I forgot to mention this, when you sell credits, some money is set aside for a long-term management fund as approved by the Corps. In our case, it's 2.5% of each credit sale goes to Campton separately, and they put it in an escrow fund for ongoing management. And they've actually hired us to do the long-term management on an annual basis because we know the site better than anybody.
But the Corps, so what I'm hearing is the Corps, at some point there is an end date with each project for Corps involvement. They don't come in after 3 years and take a look to see how many invasives have moved in. It's just totally an honor system, if you will.
Yeah, so like let me go back to, so this is our phase 2. We just completed year 4. And we met all of the 5-year performance standards, and we requested release of our final credits. Prior to that, last summer, we had the Corps and USCPA out here to conduct a final delineation approval of our constructed wetlands. They didn't release the credits because we're not in year 5, but we have an agreed amount of wetland acreage that we should get our final credit release this year. So there's a final wetland delineation. There's a sign-off site visit by the Corps before they sign off. And once they release all the credits, they're basically done.
Does the amount of the credits ever change?
Yes, actually, I'll go back to, this is our phase 1. I think we proposed 50 credits. In the end, we only got 48.8 because one area of wetland didn't qualify. Now in phase 2, and this doesn't show it, but the wetland over here got a little bigger. So this proposed 37.8 credits. I think in the end, we'll have 39 something. So the final credits are based on your final wetland delineation.
Okay.
But it should be generally close unless you have really some design issues or performance issues.
Okay.
It seems to me that we're asking Tom for concrete figures on something that it would be very difficult to pin down that way, partly because we're dealing with nature here and there are variables that are not necessarily predictable, but also all he's able to tell us about is the projects that his company has worked on. So I think we have to look at all of this as just sort of a general primer on how these projects work. I don't know that we can really draw any very concrete conclusions about our costs or how much our credits are going to sell for, et cetera. Is that accurate, Tom?
Yeah, well, George just asked me to kind of give you an education session about mitigation banking, and I have tried to do that. I hopefully helped a little
You
bit.
certainly are doing that, yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a fair question, Nikki, but I also, I think, at least I'm walking away with an order of magnitude kind of thing from Tom. Though, to make sure that I heard this correctly, you said that at least in our area, in our watershed, that SMC has set the credit value at just a little under 150K. Is that right?
Yes, that's what they're selling. Well, I guess you call them, that's their cost for an in lieu fee credit, not an actual physical credit. But what they do with their in lieu fee money is they find wetland restoration projects somewhere in that watershed.
I see. Okay. All right.
And it's basically a mechanism to provide mitigation opportunities where there's no mitigation banks.
Gotcha. So it's not exactly a free market kind of thing.
No, it's, yeah,
The invisible hand is not so invisible, and it's kind of coming in and kind of setting a standard or
yeah.
something.
So the last we heard, someone in Lake County was selling credits for 130,000 an acre. I think that was in the Fox or the Des Plaines.
Uh-huh.
There's some variability there, but if I was selling credits in this watershed, I would say, well, SMC already set the fund. That's what you got to pay. Or
Okay.
maybe it's, $5,000 less.
Yeah, yeah. We're in order of magnitude range from there.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. All right. All right. That's fair.
The other part of this equation. So we were just talking about how much a credit is worth. I still struggle with how can this task force give guidance to the Park District on what the number of wetland credits could be for all or part of the golf course property? How is that done? How expensive is that? How timely is that?
I mean, I've seen SMC's 2 concept plans, one with the part of the golf course remaining.
Yeah, let's not even about Lake Bluff, but if you would go into an environment where somebody wants you to do an assessment of the value, the number of credits potential in this property, what would that take?
Well, we actually did that for the Lake County Forest Preserve as part of an RFP process.
Okay.
We went out, we look at all the maps, like there's hydric soil maps, there's topographic information available. We'll look at those maps and go out to a site and say, here's what we think we can do from a concept plan. And it'll have X acres of wetland creation, X acres of buffer. And we can do that fairly easily just from maps and a quick field visit. We do some soil probes to evaluate the, are there drain tiles present? Are there hydric soils available? And the hydric soil maps are pretty accurate, actually. And I think, George, you asked about hydric soils. There's a fair amount of hydric soils mapped on the golf course. So there are ways to evaluate a site and come up with, at least a concept plan that, maybe it's off 10% of the actual acreage, but it's probably a good idea
Okay.
that it's a feasible site.
Tom,
Okay,
I think
what,
go ahead.
This is Nikki. I think last week Kurt Wolford described an area with hydric soil as something that wants to be a wetland, meaning that it is, I presume, relatively easy to convert.
Yeah, you would have to reestablish wetland hydrology to the hydric or wetland soils in order to establish wetland plants.
but you have a leg up if the soil is already the right kind.
Yeah, and
So Tom, going back to your slide number 19, you had reestablishment, rehabilitation. One was 100% credit, one was 50% credit. Is it your understanding that the golf course, the property we're talking about, would be at the 100% credit? That would be a
yeah,
reestablishment?
I've looked at aerials. I don't see much wetland on that property.
No, I don't think there's any.
Even if it's some soggy golf course area, that probably doesn't qualify as wetland.
Mhm.
Or even if it floods, it's still mowed turf grass most of the time.
Mhm. So it would be reestablishment, then 100% credit. Is that,
Yes, yeah,
again, not going to hold you to it, but, okay.
yeah, it looks like, I mean, any site along a river that has hydric soils has very good potential.
So how far, and I'm sorry, I'm asking a specific question about the property. How far to the east of the Skokie River would the hydric soils be appropriate for conversion into wet?
I'm gonna share my screen again.
Okay.
'Cause I had Google Earth open. Oh, there we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
So that's the golf course. This is the Google Earth soil map. I don't want that. So this 153 is a hydric soil. Pella, silty clay loam. So that's pretty extensive. This 103A is it's Houghton muck. It's a wetter soil, but it's easily drained. So if the Skokie River has been channelized and is sucking the water out of these soils, you would have to kind of figure out how to do that. And you could do that through, and I think one of the concepts showed a little re-meandering or reconstructing the creek or the river. You could do that to control hydrology, and the fact
Sure. So without getting into specific solutions, all of the golf course could be considered for wetland purposes?
well, this is an upland soil. So there's some higher, drier soils. Like this is probably a little knoll or something. But there, along a river, you typically have hydric soils.
Okay. But that would be relatively easily determinable about what portions of this big property would be potentially eligible for wetland status?
Yeah, these soil maps are generally pretty accurate.
By the way, I'm blown away when you click on one of these things and see the composition of soil.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
amazing.
this is a good tool. This is kind of how we evaluate sites. We'll put a soil map on it, get the whatever topographic information is available, like most counties have 2-foot contours. And you can, based on the topography and the hydric soils and looking at aerials, you can kind of get a pretty good idea what the potential wetland restoration or correction would be. And you
So,
have to make. Go ahead.
no, go please. I'm sorry. I thought you were finishing. Go ahead.
Yeah, the hydrology is kind of the one thing you can't predict just looking at something. But I know there's mapped floodplain here, which is a good sign that it gets wet enough perhaps to turn into wetland.
So, for example, does 696A there in the southeast corner of the parcel,
Right.
is that recoverable, or
Well, yeah,
or
you
is
can.
that would that be, less? Would we not be inclined to necessarily count on it, or is it perhaps better for an alternate use kind of thing?
Well, you can do some non-hydric or upland soils have a lot of topsoil.
Uh-huh.
So sometimes you can scrape off some of the topsoil to get it to the same elevation as the hydric soil. And if it gets wet enough, you can plant wetland plants there.
Gotcha.
We've done a little of that, but grading is kind of expensive and if you don't need to do it, you don't do it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And there are,
Fair enough.
that's kind of the design process. There are limitations on how aggressive you want to be.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay.
Tom, if the land's converted and the credits are sold, what restrictions are there on Bluff's ability to use that land? Can they use it for anything? Can they ever change and decide they don't want to be a wetland after all? I mean, what are the?
Well, it would be placed in a conservation easement in perpetuity that has certain limitations. I think George mentioned if you want to put a path or a trail through it, that could be within the wetland buffers, or you just kind of work around the wetland areas you're creating. There are some limitations. It won't go away once it's in a conservation easement as a mitigation or as a wetland.
And
So go ahead, Julie.
I was just gonna say, and then in terms of the upkeep, you've mentioned invasive species a few times now. I mean, that would be an ongoing responsibility of Lake Bluff to monitor and take care of that.
Yeah, and that's kind of, you want to maintain a certain level of quality. You don't want it to turn into a weed patch or kind of ugly, but that's up to you as the property owner. The Corps won't be involved in it after they sign off on it after five years or so.
I wanted to clarify a point that you made, Tom. You said something about, you were talking about walking paths. So where your cursor was just a moment ago, just to the right of that 698B knoll.
Yep.
Yeah, so if I wanted to put a walking path from the Park District and meander it down to that knoll, but it went through 153A and a hydric soil portion of the wetland, would the conservation easement allow me to do that? Or is that kind of that area there inviolate?
Well, you would show it as part of your mitigation bank design. So you would
Okay,
show a trail and
okay.
fit it into the wetlands or the buffer, however.
Uh-huh.
Actually, let me show you.
But you can cross a wetland area with a walking path or something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up another example we've designed for the Kane County Forest Preserve District. Might take a moment.
I think I've often seen paths like that might involve a boardwalk with, small bridges over the wetter areas, something like that. Is that the kind
Right.
of thing we would do, Tom?
Yes.
Right.
So this is a bank we designed for Kane County. And they had to relocate a path. So this is the designed berm that has a trail on it that separates. This is a restored farm ditch, basically.
I'm sorry, I'm still on Google map.
Oh, can you see that colored map?
No.
No,
No, yeah.
I know what I did. I have to. Let me start over with the sharing.
okay. There you go.
Okay. This is actually a very large mitigation bank, 182 credits, which is too many, but so the Forest Preserve had a path coming somewhere through here that we had to relocate. So the design included this berm that separates the creek from some of these wetlands that get a little higher in elevation. We actually have a berm here, and a little smaller berm to control the hydrology. But all three of these will be pedestrian paths through the mitigation complex. So there's a lot of flexibility how you design these things.
Thank you.
And just FYI, this has a stream mitigation component where and this was really basically a farm ditch that we're basically reconstructing into a little more native creek, and we're getting stream credits for that, which might be applicable for your project. And stream credits are a new market in the Chicago area. But the Corps is now requiring people that have stream impacts to buy stream mitigation credits, and these are sold on a linear foot basis. But that's the detail for later, perhaps.
Same concept though.
Yeah, it's credits at a market price.
Okay. I just have one more kind of off the wall question. Do you know of any situation where a property owner has used the future mitigation credits? So you have an approved plan, you're in your second year, you've received 30% or so of the credit, you know, they've released 30% credits. Do you know of any situation where a property owner has used the remainder of the available credits as collateral for a loan to do more
I've not-
restoration or to pay
I
off debt?
haven't heard of that, no.
Do you know if it's precluded under the Corps' contract?
I don't think so. The Corps doesn't get involved in the financial aspects of it.
That would make sense.
But you as the banker would be holding this, and how, to Steve's question, if I wanted to build some tennis courts or something and take part of the funding, that future funding, would you as our wetland banker be willing to advance us the money for that?
Maybe.
If the
Okay,
price is right, right?
all right.
Other questions? You've taken up a little over, well, almost an hour, I think.
I know, Tom, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, other questions that people?
The one thing, and if other people understand it, great, you can explain it to me, but I just would really like a really clear timeline of from this point to then, convert, do the planting, get to the first stage, it typically takes this long. And from this stage, it typically takes that long. And I heard you talk about all of the different contingencies. I know it'll be a range, but if you could just walk us through the steps quickly and tell us about how long it will take, and if you can, about how much it may cost, although I know some of it's covered by the grant, that would be really helpful to distill it down.
Well, there's a concept plan.
Okay.
The next step would be preparing a prospectus with enough detail to submit to the Corps for their initial review. And that where they said, yes, this looks like a feasible mitigation bank project. They would issue a public notice for public comment, and that kind of starts the process.
How long does that take?
Well,
I know, how
a
long?
year.
That's what we need, they're just ballpark.
And what we did with the King County Forest Preserve, they had started the prospectus and they kind of screwed it up a little bit. And the Corps gave them some bad advice. We revised the prospectus into almost a draft MBI. So we were a little ahead of the game. And the Corps kept saying, well, we have to approve the prospectus before you submit an MBI, but that's not what the rules say. So once we were comfortable, we submitted it. But it's probably 2 years until you can sell credits.
Okay.
And then 5 years.
Yeah, it's at least 5 years after that if everything works as planned.
Okay. Julie, is that help for now?
That's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions from task force members?
Just one oddball question, Tom. Do you have any idea if the Corps allows like sanitary sewers to remain as long as they're shown as part of the plan?
Yeah, I don't think that's really an issue, because if you have to go and fix it, you just have to restore the wetland you disturbed. It shouldn't affect the viability of what you're doing.
What do you know, George?
Now, there are two sanitary sewers that run completely across the golf course. The school and public sewer that serves all of the facilities of the golf course in Washington. They run all the way across the golf course, carrying sewage
Okay.
to the west, but
Okay.
it sounds like it's not an issue.
Okay, well, it's good to know though. Any other questions? If not, Tom, thank you very much. I hope we can reach out to you again, because I'm sure we'll have
Yeah, certainly. If you
and be able
feel
to pick
free
your
to
brain.
send me an email. This is part of my business development role, and I don't mind doing some marketing where there's a possible opportunity for V3.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Thank you, Tom.
Good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Okay, well, that was educational. I think we have a lot to think about, a lot to digest, but moving right along. Al, you've got a couple of maps that you want to share with us. I'm not sure which version you want to pull up, but why don't you walk us through what you found? And these, again, are just baseline showing current conditions and modified based on what I think we've learned today.
Okay, Noah, can you pull up the portrait maps to start?
Sure can. And if you would like, just tell me to advance whenever you're ready.
Okay. So what I've tried to do, you can advance, is create two series of maps to show what we've learned and what we're learning. This one, first one is a base map. And what I've been trying to do is keep the orientation the same, so that we're not constantly trying to re-understand what the map is saying. This is a map that goes from the north at 137 to the south at 176. It shows Route 41 going down and the golf course in the bottom right. And on top of this map, then we could overlay different things that we learned. Just as an interest of note, this is a FEMA map. It shows will show things based on 2013. And of interesting note, as Noah pointed out to me, it actually does show some flooding on the golf course. So if we can move to the next map, this shows the FEMA flood zones all along the Skokie River, and the areas that are hatched with red and blue is the kind of normal floodway. And then the light blue to the side of that shows the 100-year flood level. No, go back. Yes, stay there for a minute. And then the light brown outside of the blue shows the 500-year flood level. So if we go to the next slide, this is an enlargement of the bottom right-hand corner, which shows the golf course, and it shows in the the red hatched area, the normal floodway, which floods with any kind of storm. The light blue area shows the 100-year flood. And then the beigey kind of color shows a 500-year flood level. And on top of that, we put on the holes of the golf course. So we can see how much of the golf course is in a normal flood range, how much is in a 100-year flood range, and how much is in the 500-year flood range. And similar to what was noted, I think in the earlier presentation, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, holes like 10, 9, 1, 2, those are the higher level areas of the golf course, which probably aren't the hydric kind of soils that we'd be talking about for wetlands.
Can I ask a question real quick? And this would be for Noah or for Jeff. I'm not sure. How does this shading is obviously coming from the county. Does that match up with our experience? Like over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had at least a couple 100-year floods. Does that match up pretty well with our actual experience?
I would say for the most part, yes. I kind of disagree with, let's say, hole number 14, 15. It's not as bad as maybe that shows with the greenish blue color. But I would definitely concur with the 17, 5, 6, 7, 13, that kind of shading area. Again, not so much into, let's say, the bottom there, which says number 18, that number, I don't remember it ever being that bad necessarily in that general area either. So maybe those are a little bit outliers in that that area, but for the most part, definitely the hatched area and bleeding out into some of those other zones does concur.
Thank you.
Okay, if we go to the next slide, this is a slide from the Sandy Hart presentation, which shows the flood that occurred on July 11, 12, 13 of 2017. It shows the area of Route 41 that was flooded, and the area of the golf course that was flooded. If we go to the next slide, that then highlights.
As Al,
Yes.
I think those areas there on the golf course are not the areas that actually flooded. That's a repeat of the estimates from the county's mapping system, what the 100-year floodplain is. That's not a plot of what actually flooded. And that, and up above, that's actually just modeling of what flooded. None of these are actuals, certain of that. They're the best estimates, that's all. Just as a point of clarification.
Okay. If we go to the next slide, that focuses on the golf course and indicates the areas of the golf course that were, I guess, modeled to George's point, to be flooded. And then the next slide superimposes the holes of the golf course onto that, so that we can see which parts of the golf course were impacted. The newspaper reports from back then do indicate that the golf course was completely closed for a week and partially closed for another 2 to 3 weeks afterwards as a result of this incident. And this, I believe, was considered to be a 130-year flood. If we go to the next slide, this shows the areas that are deemed to be approximate areas of current wetlands. And in the green, the blue areas show water, bodies of water, and the purple areas show areas of potentially restorable wetlands.
Al, do you
Where
have
did
any
this-
idea what definition of wetland is being used here?
Not exactly, no.
Where did you get these, Al? This is really interesting.
It is a mixture of FEMA. This slide came, I believe, from the Sandy Hart presentation. But
Okay.
the next slide then shows the potential restorable wetlands highlighted on the versus the golf course. So these are all works in progress to give us an idea of what's going on. I've got a similar package of what I call the landscape maps, which show a smaller area focusing more on the Park District areas. Noah, if you can bring up the landscape orientation maps.
Can everyone see that?
Yep. Go
Mhm.
to the next slide. This focuses more on the Park District area itself. You can see the northern red line is the boundary of the Park District, goes right through the Navy base, through Route 41. With the golf course kind of in the center at the bottom. The next slide highlights the golf course area. And again, this is just happens to show an area of flooding on the golf course at the time that this was this map was created. The next slide shows the holes of the golf course with this flooding. So it shows probably about half the holes of the golf course were impacted whenever exactly this was taken. And I'm not sure exactly what the date of this map is. The next map, which FEMA has an awful lot of extra stuff on here that we don't really need. Again, shows the flood zones. The red and blue hatched area is the major floodway. The light blue area is the 100-year flood. And the brown area is the 500-year flood. So then the next slide just focuses on the golf course area. And then the next slide after that imposes the holes of the golf course over the flood zone areas. And then the next slide which Noah provided for us, maps out, looking basically at the golf course. The area in the center, highlighted by the blue border, which is the base floodway, is 31.9 acres of the golf course. And as we expand out to the 100-year flood plain area on the next slide, that's 66.3 acres. That's in the golf course area. There's a little bit of the flood zone that's outside of the actual golf course property, and that's not counted. And then the final slide, which is the 500-year map, shows 78 acres that would be included in that. And again, that doesn't include the eastern portion of the golf course, which is higher. So that's what I have so far. Still working on more, and I will try and get some hydric soil maps that we can add into this.
Yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. I like the map that shows the overlay of the golf course, because that gives you a nice visual as to the area that's actually being impacted from a practical use perspective. So thank you for working through the maps, and look forward to, to seeing more of them and to having some finalization around them. One of the things that I'm confident of, and that's because I've looked through the H&H study, so I'm sort of blending our next agenda item into the map item. The stormwater management folks have not identified the specific areas of the golf course that they're proposing for the 40 acre-feet of detention. So if you look at the H&H study, there's one or two maps, and they show a yellow box on the north end of the undefined, just a rectangle or a square, I forget. And that's where they would have the additional 40 acre-feet. So they have not, to my knowledge, done any additional work as to actually pinpointing the specific components of the 40 acre-feet of additional detention. So that's certainly, that's just a fact I think that we need to be aware of, that we haven't, that at least I didn't know until I looked through that study.
Could we back up for a moment so I could ask Al something about the map?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Al, the one map that you said you came from Sandy Hart's presentation, the one that showed the purple area as potentially restorable wetlands. I'd like to be very sure about where that came from, because I want to know if we can consider that definitive or not. I wonder if there's a way that we can find out the source of that information.
I'm looking at that presentation, and there is no, on some of the slides that were there is attribution, for example, to Hay or someone like that. And there isn't,
I've got
Nikki,
that presentation too.
That would be a question we would probably want to make sure that we understand. At the very least, it's probably somebody's opinion.
Yeah, it's labeled option 3. So it made me think that it might have been in the H&H study, but I didn't see it. So perhaps we can ask Sandy if she knows exactly where this came from, because it'd be super convenient for us if we could consider this definitive, but I don't know that we can.
Well, I'm not sure that at this point in time we can consider anything to be definitive.
Right.
I mean, all of these are approximates, they're estimates. I think until you get somebody with boots on the ground that goes out and actually, tests the soil and stuff like that, will we really know?
Well, that's my point exactly. If we knew where this came from and knew that that background work had been done, then we would have a little more reason to consider it data that we can use.
Well, I'll certainly try and find out everything I can about it.
Thank you. The maps are great. Thank you so much for doing that.
Any other comments on the maps? I'd like to move into the H&H study just quickly. It's getting late here. And that is a pretty dense study, but I have a couple of takeaways from that. I mean, it's 153 pages, but it really is about 25 or so that have most of the meat. So the H&H study essentially comes up with 5 alternatives. So when we had the presentation 2 weeks ago, we know the study area is Buckley Road on the north to Rockland on the south, that the concepts are looking at mitigating flooding on Route 41 and adjoining areas, that the modeling is not looking at increasing the volume, but increasing the velocity of the flow. So however you measure the volume of water, that volume isn't going to increase coming into the Lake Bluff area, but it would come in faster under any of these alternatives because they need to move the water out of the 41 corridor into a detention area so that 41 and surrounding environments don't flood. So that's what this is about. They've got 5 options. And as I read this, the only one that meets their criteria, the criteria which they call the controlling criteria of no downstream negative effects, no impact on downstream from any mitigation that's done in the study area, is alternative 3. And alternative 3 identifies 40 acre-feet of comparable storage at downstream location or 35 acre-feet on the Navy property. So that's why we're looking at alternative 3. I think they're focusing on that one because it's the only one that they've measured that meets the criteria. So that's why we got here. We have some other news here, and that is the cost attached to alternative 3. I'm looking at page 19 under the summary. So we have a cost which is 9.4 million. And of that 9.4 million, if you dig into the appendix, 6.9 million is for actually creating the detention storage itself. And they're using a factor of $150,000 per acre to move the dirt and to create the solution that has detention, and I'm assuming has the restoration of the topsoil into the agreed upon format. It's my understanding, and I think we all have the same understanding, that the stormwater management proposal includes their funding for all of that work, which is why this is I think of interest to a lot of folks. And I think that's what I'm getting out of the H&H study. Anybody else have a chance to take a look at it and have other comments?
Yes, I looked at it and I also came away with the feeling that the solution of creating the retention area on the Navy property was not an optimal solution.
Right.
That it would not really satisfy their conditions. So, Sandy Hart's presentation said, well, it could be Navy property, it could be the golf course. I'm not sure that if you just did the Navy property, that would really satisfy everything.
Yeah, and I think, I agree with you. I think that is something that we just need, just, well, we can ask them just to be sure. I think we know that what they did tell us that they prefer this option. And I think we now have some background for why they prefer the option.
Right.
George, I have
Go
a
ahead.
question for George. And his memory is maybe a little bit better than mine. Somebody asked before about water relief from the railroad viaduct. Somewhere in the back of my mind, IDOT was upgrading, has upgraded the pump for that, but there was some piece of this where they wanted to expand or improve the outlet pipe from that pump. And I'm assuming that that's not on this page, or is it on this page?
What page?
This would be the summary page from the H&H study.
Okay.
Is that comprehended by alternatives 1 through 3?
I haven't looked at the H&H study yet. I've been driving
Okay.
for 3 days to get back home today.
Yeah,
But
it-
the project itself that you're talking about is still something that's definitely in the works. But in concept, the last I heard, about at least 5 years ago, IDOT was going to create a underground detention facility, essentially a large tank on the west side of Highway 41 in the vicinity of the old Nolan Fire Department to mitigate. They pump more water, just like if SMC releases water at a faster rate, it has to be mitigated. And IDOT, in order to do their project, has to have a scheme to make sure that they don't cause more harm on downstream properties. But where that all stands, Mark, I don't know. That's
Yeah.
41-176. It's all part of that huge project, which 5 years from now will be 20 years from now.
Yeah, this is the railroad viaduct, George, not the.
Right, but it's all
Um,
under the big broad umbrella.
okay,
But
All
you're right, that
Mark,
there is a plan to upgrade that, because that viaduct floods also, and there is a plan to upgrade that pipe, which currently discharges at the upper end of the golf course.
yeah.
But
Nikki,
they
were
were
you-
going to create detention as part of that project, not on the golf course.
Mark, in the H&H study, starting on document page 45, they do discuss the railroad underpass, and they
okay.
conclude on document page 47 that a proper outlet for primary roadway drainage, that is pump station 41, along with a functional discharge line to the Skokie River, does exist at this location. However, a proper outlet for overflow emergency discharges from pump station 41 and crossroad flows appear to be less than adequate under severe event conditions. So I think they're saying that the pump station is adequate for normal conditions, but when they have an emergency discharge, that's when flooding occurs. I'm not sure if that's helpful or
Yeah,
not.
and thank you, and I took note of that page. Just trying to remember from my time on the village board, there was something like I had said, there's something about that IDOT had either has or was imminent to install an upgraded pump, but was not upgrading the outlet pipe, which would constrain the pump or constrain the ability of the pump to evacuate the viaduct. My only concern was that if they then turned around and went from a 24 to a 48-inch, I have no idea, outlet pipe that dumped onto the golf course, that we would now have some additional velocity that we
Yeah.
had not, that may not have been comprehended in the H&H study, and whether or not we needed to go back and ask for some additional data crunching.
I think they did already upgrade the pump at this point, maybe as long ago as 5 years.
Okay,
And then also in reference to what George was saying about that entire interchange project, given what I know from being peripherally involved with the Rockland Fire Protection District, IDOT has fairly recently said, yes, that was peripheral, Mark. IDOT has fairly recently said that that is, they expect that to be sooner rather than later. Now, I've lived here for over 30 years, and they've been saying a lot of things for a lot of time, but it does appear to be like in the 5-year plan or so, I believe.
okay.
I don't have any idea what impact that'll have on drainage, though.
Yeah, so Steve, we probably ought to ask that question to make sure that we've got a comprehensive document here that at the last minute that, you know, I think much like last week, we discovered that these documents don't include the upgraded 100-year flooding that's currently already been enacted by FEMA and IEPA. It's not comprehended by any of the documentation that we have that we've been provided to date. And Lord knows what additional factors would be added to that within the 5 to 8 year scope of this project. Because working from the village board standpoint, we were blindsided by what I think it was about a 15% bump in the 100-year flood regulations.
Mhm.
So not wholly surprised, but the actual documentation of that resolution was a big surprise to us.
Well, the maps that we have from FEMA are 2013 maps. They
Yeah,
have not
there you go.
released their update yet. It's
Yeah.
still, they have preliminary data, but they haven't released anything.
Right.
So
Right.
yes, that is an issue, but also I wasn't under the impression in going through the H&H study that it included the area of Rockland Road and 141.
No,
I thought it stopped north of there.
right. But the viaduct, I would think, should have been comprehended. And as Nikki pointed out, on page 45, you said, there's something there.
Page 45 of the PDF, yeah.
Yeah. So,
So the H&H study, my recollection includes analysis of the railroad track viaduct and where water flows and how detention needs to happen.
okay.
The 176 underpass is not in that study. That's out of scope.
Correct.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Al, for the maps. So we're going to have another presentation next week from a different perspective, but really on the same thing. These will be case studies from an end user perspective, from folks who have actually been involved in creating the wetland and how they did it and how they used it. But I think there's just a couple of things I want to run through with this group before we close tonight. Maybe it's just me. I want to know, I want somebody walking the ground up there, out on the golf course, that can tell us what the maybe it's what the maximum potential wetland credits could be. I mean, I think without that number, we're kind of fishing around here. So I would suggest that we begin a process, and Emily, I'll if it's okay with the task force, I can work with Emily to figure out a process of how we get somebody on the ground to give us that, if it's an estimate, but at least it's a validation of numbers that many of us have seen and many in the community have already seen. It would also help us understand the process of how they make that determination of what's actually involved. So I would like to get that process started right away, if everybody agrees with that.
I agree.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I also want to engage the stormwater management people with a couple of questions that I think are yes or no for them, maybe not. But we know that they have evaluated the downstream flow under the H&H study, and they need 40 acre feet of detention. They're looking to put all of that in the golf course. So number one, that needs to be adjusted by whatever the new rainfall or floodplain numbers are. And if that's 15%, we need a new number, because that increases under their do nothing scenario, it increases the amount of detention they're asking left to provide at the golf course, right? So I think we could ask them for that. The second thing I wonder about is, should at least in our discussion, should we consider the impact of future development in the study area, i.e. Buckley to Rockland, and further north in the watershed? And what may happen if there's not mitigate, they will tell us they will mitigate they will have detention requirements. But should we think about, if it's 40 acre feet, should we add 10% just to not have, because we don't want to, disturb whatever the ultimate use of that land is. We want to make sure that additional flow of water isn't going to destroy it. So that's another question I would have with them. I would also ask them, to validate, and they will say yes, you will pay for construction, design, legal, everything, because it's in the document, for 40 acre feet. Will you do it for 60 acre feet? What if we want to create more detention, more wetland? Is there a maximum to the amount of ground that you will move to meet your needs? What's the maximum that we should think of as detention?
Yeah, Steve, let me just, I want to refine that point. I agree with you, but I don't just want validation. I want to see in writing specifically exactly what it is that they are going to cover, for what duration, to what caps, all of that. Do we have any writing like that? Because I think we need real detail on that.
Yeah,
point.
I think we ultimately do. I think a commitment that they're going, I think we have a commitment from, probably not a commitment. They're proposing 40 acre feet of detention on the golf course property that they will pay for, but we need much more structure and detail around that. Yeah. They will not be able to give us until there's a final approval and design as to exactly what it will look like, where it will go. And I didn't understand until we got through this process here that they haven't gotten that far, because that's a joint design effort between the stormwater management people and the park district. Right? That's what they said 2 weeks ago, that they will design this the way that the community of Lake Bluff wants it to be designed, as long as it meets their needs. So they can't tell us exactly where it's going to go, because that's part of design, but they can tell us the parameters under which they'll pay for it. And I think, Julie, that's what we need to work with them.
Well, I'm wondering if we don't need to look at this as 2 phases. One phase to accommodate the requirements now, and a second phase to accommodate expected future requirements. Because I don't think SMC is going to do anything more than what their current requirements are. But if we look at the future of the golf course area, we wouldn't want to design a retention pond for 40 acre feet of retention that couldn't be expanded.
I think that's, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we need to confirm this, but my my recollection from last meeting was that SMC would need at least 40 acre feet, but was recommending more, and that they would cover whatever amount we would choose to, if we decided to go the wetlands route, they would cover as much of it as we wanted to do. And certainly we wanted to make sure that we were.
And to Steve's point, I'm sitting here scratching on the back of the envelope, so to speak. The golf course someplace is like 105 acres or something like that, over 100. Art and his calculations came up with the one alternative that was like 78 acres. The presentation that SMC gave to us, the carrot they're dangling is 77 credits, 77 acres. And the need is 40. So we've got a big disconnect here, to your point, Steve.
Yeah, and I remember that we've been asked to comment on alternative land use. And I think we need to keep that in the back of our mind too. So the deciding factor is how much acreage does the stormwater management folks, what do they need? What do they think is adequate? We need to have 40 acre feet plus 15% plus a contingency, maybe, so that becomes, if the park district decides to do this, that kind of becomes the minimum offer, if you would. We'll accept 45 acre feet on property and work with you to figure out where it goes. So that's one part of, and then how big is 40 acre feet and what does that do to the footprint of what exists on the golf course now? Without regard of what alternative use that might be. So that's kind of one stream. And then another stream is, what's the maximum that could be covered under this grant? Because the only way this works is that the stormwater management people pay for, what's the maximum SMC is going to pay for
Right.
doing work that
For the project.
For the project, yeah. And then what does that affect future land use? The potential for future land use on that acreage. So I think we've gotten a long way in a couple of weeks, but we got a few more questions we need to ask. And again, if it's okay with the task force, I will initiate some discussions with John and with the SMC folks and Emily, if that's appropriate, to kind of begin the dialogue and get some of these questions answered.
Getting back to Julie's point,
Yeah.
what sort of guarantee or promise in writing would we be willing to consider adequate in regard to, how many acres they would pay for or any of these other things? I understand the need to get documentation, but there are also still a lot of unknowns, and it may be difficult for them to commit to something where we just don't know where we're going yet.
Yeah, my personal perspective is that if I have a document from Stormwater Management Commission that says we will be happy to develop 54.5 acre feet of detention and pay for the restoration, a letter from them at this point is fine. And then it's up to the park district to decide what to do with it and to negotiate any contract or whatever terms there are, whatever guarantees, who's the banker, all the other stuff that goes with it. I mean, I think our responsibility is to firm up their offer and get a document in writing that we can present to the park district as this is what we understand the position to be.
Maybe we ought to ask SMC, if we're talking to them, the $1 million question of the how firm is the grant? If elections happen one way in November, there's grant dollars. Grants have been frozen before.
It's a good, yeah, I'll put that on the list.
And then just when Mark was making some comments earlier, I think it's important for everyone to remember that 40 acre feet could only mean 20
Right.
acres of wetland, or it could be 80 acres, depending upon
How
the
deep it
depth of
is.
storage. So,
Yeah.
so that we don't confuse those numbers.
Yeah, and George, to that end, I would like this whole group to think about the creation of a visual image of what, if this would be approved, what this would actually look like on the golf course. Because I know, I'll use this parallel, probably not the best one. The first time I drove down Deer Path to go to the hospital and saw all the dirt that was being moved for the project that was happening on 41 and on Deer Path, I went, oh my God, what's going on here? And is that comparable to what is going to happen to the beautiful golf course? Is that going to look like that? Is it going to be big holes in the ground? What's it going to look like? So the creation of this visual, which I don't have in my head yet, I think is something we need to think about. And I'm not sure how we solve that. Okay.
I think part of the problem there, Steve, is that there are many, many possible visuals, all the way from a relatively small area of the golf course with the golf course still existing, all the way up to the golf course not existing and having it filled with native plants and paths and recreation areas. We have a huge spectrum of options in front of us, assuming that the grant covers that much.
Yeah, and I'm going to assume the grant's going to cover it, even though that's a good question, but I'd like to think positive about our elected officials. And you're right, we need to look at all of those. So from a land use perspective, what is the minimum, in order to meet the requirements of the stormwater management request, what is the minimum that would be done to the existing golf course? What would the minimum be done, and what would that look like? And then move it into different criteria. Be able to give the Park District Board some, not options necessarily, but some beginning points for thinking through how this might actually work. Okay, let's go to task force member reports. Everyone has been absolutely fantastic in working through their assignments. George, thank you for setting up the conversations today. George also has volunteered to sit in on, I think they're monthly meetings of the stormwater management group. So the Corps and the Department of North Chicago and the Transportation Department. So they get together by Zoom every month and talk about this project. And George is going to be our eyes and ears on that. So thank you for that. Mark, you want to give us just a quick update on what to expect 2 weeks from now?
Yeah, the Libertyville Township supervisor will be talking to us, and she has completed a couple of projects and has a third project underway. The third project that's underway, I think we had talked about, is on Atkinson Road. And they had, they've completed these. They used, it sounds like they used a design build consultant, a banking consultant for the first study or project or projects. The latest one, they are doing the banking themselves, if I understood what she said. So I think we may have some real boots on the ground kind of input here, and maybe a bit of a different perspective from the one that we got tonight in terms of kind of where from our viewpoint, through maybe closer to our lens than looking at it from the standpoint of the consultant. And I'll also try to put a couple slides together on the Highland Park project. As I mentioned last week, they basically mothballed their golf course, but they didn't do any of this kind of stuff. They didn't do banking, got no credits for it whatsoever. They basically just turned it into a recreation area. And they did a little they planted some prairie seed, trying to think of a more sophisticated kind of a term for that, but they put down some seed. They moved very little dirt at all. And they received the outflow through that property that comes down our stream from our golf course. So it all ends up in their backyard. So, and I'm gonna go down and walk that over the next week or two as well, and maybe shoot a couple photos and things like that.
That'd be great. It's my am I correct in that there still is a golf course right there? There's another,
No.
there were.
No, the golf course is, the golf course is gone.
Yeah, but
You can still see it.
Wasn't there another one?
Yeah,
That's still
Wait.
separated?
what happened was I spoke to the director from the Highland Park District. So this one was a city golf course, and the Park District owned a Park District golf course that was very close, so they were competition with each other. So the Park District bought this golf course for $500,000 from the city, and because the competition is close to their course, they wanted to turn it into a recreation area. So they're spending a couple of $1 million to make it a more of a prairie and wild area.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I also understand that there were significant deed restrictions on the property that did not allow them to make significant changes to it. I
There you
heard
go.
that they couldn't even remove sand traps. So they didn't have the kind of option that we do in terms of turning it into a wetland area. Basically, all they could do, from my understanding, is seeding and maybe getting rid of some invasives.
Yeah, well, their project manager was not quite, she didn't explain all that. We'll put it that way. The way, as she explained it, they chose not to do that.
Yeah.
And
So that'll be a good discussion for a couple more case studies for 2 weeks from now. And we'll probably have some more as we come up.
yeah,
Rob is working on golf course financials. I'm debating whether we try to do that in 2 weeks as well. It'll depend on, I need to talk with Rob about what the presentation will be like. We may do it in 2 weeks. We may wait for do it in 4 weeks. But that's yet to come. Rob's working on that. Al is doing a great job on the maps, and those will be really helpful. And I think we're going to keep referring to them. Julie's is thinking through the legal, regulatory, the environment that is involved both with the stormwater management folks and with especially the mitigation banking and the creation of credits and all of that stuff. So she's doing some research and is beginning to think through what we need to share with the Park District on some of the mechanism of making this happen and some of the processes that we need to put in place. And Nikki is working on not only our recap of facts, but also now on a dictionary of facts, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more things. The more we can document as we go along, the better that will be. So thank you all. I will be on the chairman's report. I'm going to be, as we discussed, working with the stormwater management people to get a better understanding and to get some clarity around some of the questions. We have a lot more clarity, I know I do, than I had 2 weeks ago. We get more clarity around that. I will be working to get a handle on how many credits we could generate in that area, the golf course area. And I'm still looking for a mitigation banker, somebody who can just talk about not the ecological perspectives, but how you actually do the banking, how that process actually works. And I've got a couple of leads that I'll be working on.
well, the township supervisor may be able to provide you with some of that perspective herself.
Yeah. And Nikki, do you We had a lot of facts today. Do you want to recap any, or do you just want to defer that to your written report?
Boy, oh boy. In taking notes, I decided not to record things that are also in one of the presentations. So definitions and facts that were in Tom's presentation today, I did not write down. Very briefly, I got the definition of a wetland, which I think is going to be extremely helpful. I noted what agencies are involved in getting the banking instrument established. You made a good summarizing comment, Steve, having to do with maximization of the dollars that could result from the sale of credits would not be fully realized for 8 to 10 years after the decision is made. And I'll include what goes into that. I got the definition of hydrology, which will go into the glossary. The fact that the quality of the wetland is dependent on both the hydrology and the plant community. The SMC in lieu fee credit is $150,000, so that gives us sort of a point of reference. And then things that you mentioned, Steve, from the H&H study essentially just recapped our take from the SMC presentation last time, so I did not note those again. As you said, this is going to be a kind of a cumulative listing of facts. So I'll put those in writing and I'll send them to John and Julie, and then Julie probably has some things she'll want to add to it.
Perfect. Thank you. This is very helpful. Emily, any board liaison? Emily, by the way, is working through some communication so that we have processes in place so the broader Lake community can learn more about what we're doing, either come to these meetings, look at our material, look at the website. But Emily, anything else?
No, I think that's great that you mentioned that. Yeah, the communication's up already. John and staff posted it on the website, and then we're going to follow up with that. And just as a reminder, on the newsletter with all the information you just mentioned, the meetings, the agenda, all the links are on there, so folks can see it, and if they have any questions, it's right there. Also, we'll talk about what you mentioned earlier. There's nothing to report from the board, and there's no questions, so I'll just wait from the discussion point of maybe finding to see if we can have somebody come down and touch the soil and see how much that would cost. But nothing to report from the board. No, they haven't mentioned anything. We do have a meeting on Monday, so if there's anything you want me to relay, but I think it's just that, right?
Great.
Okay.
Okay, great. John?
The next board meeting is February 28th. So it's a couple of weeks. No, other than, again, as Commissioner Lane was mentioning, that it is on our website where we're uploading all the information. There's a tab on the home page. I'll take it directly to the task force information. So it's a good way to keep track of that. The other thing, we're including a link in a blurb in our newsletter, a weekly newsletter that's sent out, that's emailed out. We'll start to put some information out on social media as well, just to try to share the information with the community as it comes in. And I think that's really about all that I have for staff right now.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, if there's, I see we still have a few people that have, from the audience, that have hung in there for the entire meeting. If anybody has a question on what we discussed tonight or needs some clarification, now's the time to raise your hand. And Jeff will let us know if there's hands being raised.
Yep, there are none.
Last chance for I see the rapidly shrinking audience. I see the numbers going down. Okay, our next meeting is in 2 weeks, whatever that date is, 2 weeks from today, the 22nd, I guess. 22nd. We'll go through our normal agenda. We'll have the case studies from Mark, and we may or may not have golf course financials. I need to talk with Rob about that. Anything else from the task force? Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
anybody opposed? I don't think so. Unanimously approved. It is 9:05. Thank you all very much. We're making great progress, and I look forward to talking with you in the next 2 weeks and see you live by Zoom and the 22nd. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Good night.
Good night.